Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. Phone lines are open for your questions right now. And now, Chief Counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, Jay Sekulow.
We've got a very special broadcast today, and that is, we don't often get to do this, but Pastor Andrew and wife Noreen Brunson are with us in our studios here at our media center. Look, normally the way these things work, and you know this, and we're just thrilled that they came in and talked to our staff today, our team today, which was really important. But the way these things work is when we're done with one case, we say the same thing, next case. And the next case, of course, is Pastor John Saw. And that is a pastor, again, a permanent American resident, in jail in China, now going on 2 years. Same kind of situation there. But we're going to talk to the Brunsons about their situation. But before we do, let's get an update on Pastor Saw's case, because that's ongoing right now. Cece?
Right. So Pastor Saw had an outstanding appeal that the court would just never hear. Pushed it and pushed it and pushed it and just delayed it. We went to the working group on arbitrary detention. We've gone to the Capitol several times in D.C., and have pushed for him to at least have an appeal because he was wrongfully convicted, sentenced to 7 years in prison. Just recently, he finally got his appeal, but they didn't hear his case. All they did was announce that they were sending him on to prison. So he's now been transferred to prison after already sitting in a detention center for 2 years. He's now been transferred to prison and going through what they call an orientation period, which is basically kind of the brainwashing period that they do to the prisoners. Unfortunately, for these 2 years that he has been, over 2 years that he's been in prison, he has not been able to see his family at all. He has not been allowed any visitation with his wife or his 2 sons. During the time in the detention center, he only was allowed visitation with his attorneys. That happened maybe once every 2 months. So it's a very difficult situation for him because he really does not know what's going on. And there are times where we can't even have any access to him.
I think it's important, too. This was something we were talking about with Pastor Brunson, with Pastor Saw's case. And it just brought up this idea that Pastor Saw has not had any visitation. And you talked about, Pastor Brunson, the idea that when you started to have some visitation once a week, when Noreen was able to visit you and kind of give you updates and information, encouragement, that was very significant for you.
It was a lifesaver for me. I was very isolated. I didn't have other Christians around me. I was surrounded completely by Muslims. So I felt very isolated in my faith especially. And so to meet with Noreen, she was the only Christian I could meet with.
Were they actually letting Noreen in the room, or was it through glass?
It was through reinforced glass and on telephones.
Yep.
So we had about 35 minutes in one prison, and the next one, it was like Kevin, I got up to 1 hour with her a week. Yep. And that was a time when she would come in and encourage me and speak truth to me. And that would keep me going to the next week.
Noreen, because one of the things I remember that we were concerned about during every time you were, I know you were speaking to Cece, but something I was concerned about as the chief counsel of this organization is I was worried about them picking you up because they had originally pulled you for detention. So I was always worried about, we got to keep an eye on that to make sure we don't end up with 2 picked up. Was that ever a concern of yours? I know you were.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It was, it was a possibility. And especially in the beginning, in our apartment building. So, you asked, what is it living over there? It's very dense. So high rises, and I would hear people in the stairs of the building. And especially if I'd hear men's voices, several men, then I think, are they coming to my door?
Yeah.
So that was definitely, a possibility. But
she stayed at personal risk to herself.
Yes.
And she did this because she was the only person who could visit me. And so she was really keeping me alive there.
Really, really important. Then I want to only 30 seconds here before we go to a break. This was a monumental effort by your team up there as well.
Yeah, the scope and breadth of this was really unsurpassed, Jay. But look, the response from the United States government was unified as well. We can get into some of that. But a big part of this, Jay, was the United States speaking with one voice.
You have to understand, for us at the ACLJ, it's next case. And the next case is Pastor Saw. We've been talking about his case on radio and a little bit on TV. We're now trying to raise the level of interest in that case, raise the awareness of that case. He's been in prison in China now for 2 years. He was starting educational facilities. He'd been doing it for years, never a problem, and all of a sudden he got picked up. Same kind of thing, always national security. We've got a petition that's up at ACLJ.org. We want to present that to Congress and to the UN. Sign it now, ACLJ.org. That's ACLJ.org. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
Christian pastor John Saw, a U.S. permanent resident, has been wrongfully convicted and sentenced in China. After decades working in China and Burma, providing for the poor, sharing the love of Christ, and establishing schools for impoverished children, Pastor John was arrested and imprisoned by Chinese authorities. Pastor John's wife and 2 sons, all U.S. citizens from North Carolina, desperately want their father released and returned home to America. Pastor John has been unjustly targeted for his Christian faith and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He's now been imprisoned 2 years. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're representing Pastor John's family, aggressively working internationally and in this country for his ultimate freedom. Stand with us. Sign on to our petition to free Pastor John Saw. You can add your name right now online at aclj.org.
Hey, welcome back to the broadcast, everyone. Taking your calls at 800-684-3110. We're here with Noreen Brunson and Andrew Brunson, and we're getting phone calls coming in as well at 800-684-3110. I want to go to Cece and, well, first let me ask this to Pastor Brunson and to Noreen. So to Andrew and Noreen. So, Andrew, when you found out you were going to be released, I mean, actually, it first was home confinement, correct? You were sent to your home, which had to still be a relief.
After prison, I was sent to home confinement. But it was still very stressful because then the economy started going bad under the sanctions. And so I didn't know what was going to happen. And at any point, they could put me back in prison.
And there were calls for that.
Yes. Well, within Turkey.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
We knew here that those sanctions were going to ultimately get you out quicker because the economic impact. This was actually, as I said, not jokingly, I mean, I don't know if it was Financial Times or one of them, it may have been CNBC. It was one of the financial papers said that on Jay Sekulow's radio broadcast, they mentioned that there was progress made in Pastor Brunson's case and the lira had an uptick. I mean, this tells you how it was the geopolitical aspects of this. When you do these kind of cases, folks, and this is where I appreciate our ACLJ members, understand from our team, we're handling it with the media, we're handling it with the diplomacy, we're handling it with, Than's handling it with government affairs, Cece's handling a legal end in Turkey, we're working the congressional issues here. But let me tell you what else we're working on, the economics. In these cases when that economic issue can be helpful. And then here, it made a gigantic difference.
It made a huge difference, Jay. First of all, hello, Andrew and Noreen. Good to see you again. But look, on this case of sanctions, and Jay, you will remember this, specifically an issue involving the F-35s. That is something that Congress was willing to put pressure on from the beginning. And most administrations, Jay, would not allow that to happen because think about how significant an ally Turkey was and is, both on the economic side and the military side. Any idea of fracturing some of those security agreements would have been opposed by many administrations. This administration was open to that conversation, Jay. And so I know you remember this, but just so our listeners remember, in addition to the sanctions, just a couple of months before Pastor Brunson was released, Congress sent to the president a bill that actually said no more F-35s until Pastor Brunson is home. Those combinations of pressure points, Jay, were a big reason that he came home.
That was deemed at the time to be a controversial move because some of our friends were concerned. I will tell you this, though. We were working all of the back channel information on this to keep this thing, to keep the case moving forward. That's you want to get some kind of momentum going here.
Pierce is calling from North Carolina on line 1 and has a question for the Brunsons. Pierce, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live. You're on the air.
Quick question. Me and my wife's been called to do mission work in Bangladesh. We actually leave 2 weeks from today. And I just had a question for Pastor about how he knew, and maybe he could share about the call God put on his life to go and do long-term missions and what that was like.
Thanks, Pierce.
Well, for many years, I wanted to be a missionary since I was a kid. And we went to the largest unevangelized country in the world. I think now is the time for Muslims, time for the church to be focused on winning them. They are obviously a huge group with very few believers in them. So I I think this is a time for Muslims.
So it was early. When you say it was early, was this when you were a kid? Early on in your life?
Yes.
What about you, Noreen?
There is a story behind it, actually. He had a very unusual calling, and I realized after I met him that if I marry this man, I'm going to the mission field. So it was a package deal. Am I willing for this or not? I followed, and then the Lord really worked it in my heart.
Yeah. So you go to Turkey, you get there, you establish the church. I mean, it's hard for people to understand that for over 2 decades, you really, other than you had occasional issues, but you didn't have governmental issues of this significance. Did this literally come out of the blue?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm the first person who's been put in prison in Turkey, so it was really unexpected.
For this kind of, for being a Christian, yeah. I mean, to me, Cece, that was always the issue here. It was like, what trigger? You always wonder, what was the triggering event?
Right. We tied it back to the failed coup attempt that happened just, previous to you being picked up in October. It happened that summer. And it seemed like that President Erdogan was targeting anyone who he thought was a threat to his regime. And that would, of course, include Christians. And then, but Pastor Brunson became kind of a little bit higher than just a Christian to deport.
There's also a careful balance in this of elevating these cases and making sure you are not over elevating the case.
Yeah.
One thing that we pointed out, I remember pointing out to our audience here, especially as this got more and more heated when the sanctions issue came up and the 2 individuals from the Erdogan government were sanctioned. I think it was his justice minister and his interior minister, so 2 very high-ranking officials. And the economy in Turkey just started tanking very quickly, having a worldwide impact, all because of the U.S. Demand that Pastor Brunson be released. But we reminded people that, here in the United States, we have this 24-hour, 24/7 news cycle. There's all these stories, and you were on. I mean, the story was on. It was being covered and talked about. The President of the United States is talking about it. But in Turkey, you were like a front page news item every single day. You might not have seen it because you were in prison, but I mean, it was every day, some really nasty stuff, horrible allegations about, the spying and the threat that he posed to the country. I mean, just tell people about that. In Turkey, they really made this kind of story about
which
Pastor
affected your
Brunson,
safety.
which I think also was probably tied to the fact that they had never done this before to a Christian or to an individual like this, to imprison them. So they had to make up a story about why.
So I think the Turkish government was behind. It was a propaganda campaign in the media, and the attempt was to paint Christians in a very negative way. So there's already a negative perception of Christians, but it was to inflame this. And by saying all these things about me, they were painting me with a brush, but they were also painting the entire Christian church, the community in Turkey, with the same thing. And this is preparing the ground so that in the future, when there is persecution, then the majority of Turkish citizens will say, well, they deserve it.
Tina writes, were you able to have a Bible in prison?
Eventually. Every time they moved me to a new place, there were questions about that. Sometimes I didn't have one, and sometimes I did.
Yeah. How traumatic was, when you were moved to a different location, how traumatic was that as a prisoner?
It could be very traumatic. Yes.
Don't know what you're going to. You become institutionalized. Any little change affects more than it normally would.
Yeah.
I saw that clearly.
And some of the things I had won in previous places, I could lose in the next place.
Right. Didn't necessarily
like my
transfer.
books or a Bible, for example. Yeah.
So, Noreen, the church, Andrew's in jail. What's happening to the church at that time?
We continued. So I was just so proud of them for continuing and pressed into God, prayed, worshiped.
Unafraid, really.
Kept going.
Yeah.
I think there was fear, but
there was fear.
there
was fear.
They showed great courage.
But in the midst of that,
yeah,
they kept going.
So we have a Facebook comment that came in from Christine, and she asked, "Is that church still operating today in Turkey?"
It is.
It is.
Yes.
I mean, that's great news for people.
And
to understand.
And more and more seekers, and people are linking this directly to the amount of prayer that poured into Turkey.
Yeah.
There is a difference being seen in a number of churches already.
Hey, Than, what do you think was the moment, politically, I mean, I know the White House side because I was in that, but on the Hill, what was the moment? I mean, there were several, but what would you say the cascading moments here were, the kind of key points along the way, for people to understand what it takes to do this?
Yeah, I would give you a couple of, Jay. First, one is more of a geopolitical factor, and one is a personal factor. The personal factor really is one of the unsung heroes in this case, and that's the Brunson's daughter, Jacqueline, who came to the Hill to testify in front of the Helsinki Commission. I think Cece talked about her testifying in front of the Human Rights Council in Geneva as well. But, Jay, that put a face with a story. You know, obviously, Pastor Brunson is in prison on the other side of the world, and Noreen is over there with her. But Jacqueline came to the Hill to put a face to the case. I think that made a big difference here in Washington, D.C. And then geopolitically, Jay, I really think it was the White House being willing to stand behind pressure points. I know we talked about this generically, but you know, I'm holding in my hands a letter from 66 United States senators demanding Pastor Brunson's release. You can't get 66 senators to agree on just about anything in Washington, D.C. The reason they fell in line to such an extent, though, Jay, is because they were getting a signal from down the street that the president, the commander-in-chief, was willing to use sanctions, was willing to use security force to get Pastor Brunson's release. I think those two things are really the things that started to turn the tide, and I think Turkey saw, look, this is inevitable. It's just a matter of how long this pain is going to continue. We want to turn that pain off, so we'll send him home.
We're going to play Jacqueline's appearance before the UN's Human Rights Council either during the break or when we come back. How long is it, team?
Minute 38.
Yeah, let's play it on air when we come back from the break. I think it's important to do it. All right, well, last segment, so we'll take some more calls, more comments. 800-684-3110, 800-684-3110. Cece, quickly, when did you know it was done?
You know, I really think there were a couple times throughout the 2-year period, but I think when the whole world started the economic pressure of, look, we're all going to pull out of Turkey, where they were watching what was going to happen with Pastor Brunson, that's when I knew, okay, something's going to happen, because it wasn't just the United States, it was the world then. I was getting calls from Turkey's lobbyists. They were concerned. So, end result was pretty great. Again, your thoughts, your prayers, your support for our work allowed us to work on those cases. I'm going to, in the next segment, kind of take you through what that's like as well. So we'll be back with more in a moment. We're talking to Pastor Brunson and his wife, Noreen, but as we go to a break, you have to understand, for us at the ACLJ, it's next case, and the next case is Pastor Saul. We've been talking about his case on radio and a little bit on TV. We're now trying to raise the level of interest in that case, raise the awareness of that case. He's been in prison in China now for 2 years. He was starting educational facilities. He'd been doing it for years, never a problem, and all of a sudden he got picked up. Same kind of thing, always national security. We've got a petition that's up at aclj.org. We want to present that to Congress and to the UN. Sign it now, aclj.org. That's aclj.org. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
Christian pastor John Saw, a U.S. permanent resident, has been wrongfully convicted and sentenced in China. After decades working in China and Burma, providing for the poor, sharing the love of Christ, and establishing schools for impoverished children, Pastor John was arrested and imprisoned by Chinese authorities. Pastor John's wife and 2 sons, all U.S. citizens from North Carolina, desperately want their father released and returned home to America. Pastor John has been unjustly targeted for his Christian faith and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He's now been imprisoned 2 years. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're representing Pastor John's family, aggressively working internationally and in this country for his ultimate freedom. Stand with us. Sign on to our petition to free Pastor John Saw. You can add your name right now online at aclj.org.
Joined by Pastor Andrew Brunson's wife, Noreen. You just said something very interesting before we went on the air, Andrew. We were on this break, and that was from the courthouse to the White House, basically.
I was standing in a Turkish courtroom, and I was convicted of terrorism, and I thought I was going back to prison, and within a day, we're in the White House. So it's a pretty amazing turnaround, Joseph story.
I do remember our friend Rick Rennell, who's the ambassador from the United States to Germany, met you. Was it like 2 o'clock in the morning when you... Tell me about that. What was that like?
We arrived in Germany, and we got off the plane, And there's someone waiting with an American flag, and he said he's the U.S. ambassador. I thought, what is he doing here at 2 a.m. to meet us? It was really amazing.
Well, he's a believer. He takes it seriously, and he was a big advocate for you in Germany and in Europe, because we had to get Europeans involved. I mean, that's part of what happens here. I wanted to say this, and this is no knock on anybody's approach. And let me tell you what the ACLJ's model of these cases are: to be very public. We have not found, and Than, I know, and you and Jordan probably want to comment on this. We have not found that quiet diplomacy on these kind of cases, other than maybe a week, generally works. We have not. Again, I'm not knocking anybody else that handles these, but the cases we've gotten involved in, we've been very public, very quickly.
Yeah, if you're not, Jay, it gives them the cover of darkness to do whatever they want. I mean, we have found that exposing what is going on to the world is the best chance for success in the end, and I think that was particularly important in this case. I mean, look, Jay, one of the things that made this case so different is usually it's with a nation like Iran, who is, naturally hostile with the United States, or even China, who's not an enemy, they're an ally, but they're sort of adversarial. In this case, we were dealing with a country that's a NATO ally that we wanted strong economic ties with, and Jay, we just thought it was really important that the whole world saw what was happening, because even people inside Turkey, Jay, were not going to stand for this. So, just a second ago, you mentioned Ambassador Grinnell and the European support that we got from it. Jay, I'm holding in my hands a letter that was signed by 100 members of the European Parliament demanding Pastor Brunson's release. These are members of Parliament, Jay, that he's not a constituent of theirs. He's not a citizen of their country, but it was so important that the eyes of the world were on the case so that this wouldn't happen in cover of darkness. And in other cases, we've seen it too. That really is a critical component to making sure you get a positive outcome.
Yeah, I think you have a situation like in Iran where people are you could be arrested and be hanged the same day. You don't give them even a day. You have to start, these campaigns immediately, put them on notice, and kind of shame the government. Same with
job
Sudan.
One is keep them alive.
Same
Keep
with
the
Sudan,
person in
like
prison alive.
Ibrahim situation that we've dealt with. You've got to immediately keep. Here, Turkey was supposed to be different, right? A NATO ally, but we did not give them a lot of time. We gave about a week to say, okay, we'll let you try to figure this out. But by the way, we have a pretty good relationship with the President of the United States, and you're a NATO ally. So you're about to be shamed to the entire world if you do this. And they called a bluff. They said, okay. Erdogan stood up tough and said, okay, let's see if you actually do it. The president sent out tweets. I remember when we saw it, I think I woke up to him because he tweets sometimes pretty early. And he tweeted out that he was thinking about putting sanctions on Turkey. And then a day later, I think he tweeted, I have sanctioned 2 of the Turkish leaders. So, I mean, it was intense pressure coming from one nation to another. And I think, again, it is a huge contrast in how the work we've done with these previous cases. We keep the similar strategy, but we had a like-minded strategist to work with.
The United States will impose large
sanctions
sanctions on Turkey for their long-time detainment of Pastor Andrew Brunson, a great Christian family man and wonderful human being. That's from the President of the United States.
And I don't think Turkey thought he was going to do it, and then he did.
Well, he did it. And that was, I remember a couple of times when it was pretty intense on what he was going to do, and he did do it. I think it made a big difference in Pastor Brunson's case. A good question that's coming in, I got a number of good questions coming in, and then I want to play Jacqueline at the UN. But this one first. This is from Frankie, and she said, Pastor, could you feel the prayers of God's people?
Noreen would tell me people were praying. I say in prison, there was grace, but it was an unfelt grace. Most of the time, God was teaching me to stand in the dark. But I know that it's the prayers of God's people that sustained me and brought me out.
Well, here's your daughter at the United Nations Human Rights Council.
I pass the floor to European Center for Law and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here today on behalf of the ACLJ, who is representing my father, Pastor Andrew Brunson, the innocent United States citizen who has been wrongfully imprisoned in Turkey now for almost a year and a half, and yet he has still not been formally charged with any crime. Having grown up in Turkey, it has been hard for me to understand the situation. My family loves and respects the Turkish people, and my father has been dedicated to serving them for over 2 decades. I know the allegations against him are absurd. He is not an armed terrorist trying to overthrow any government. My father is a peaceful pastor. My family has suffered greatly during the past year and a half, which has been filled with tears and countless unanswered questions. I visited my father last August, and we sobbed the entire visit. It was hard to see him so broken, so thin, so desperate. He wrote a note last week which said, "Let it be clear, I am in prison not for anything I have done wrong, but because of who I am, a Christian pastor. I desperately miss my wife and children. Yet, I believe this to be true. It is an honor to suffer for Jesus Christ, as many have before me. My deepest thanks to all those around the world who are standing with and praying for me. Turkey should not get away with holding my father one more day. Please make any and all efforts to secure my father's release and safe return to the United States. He's been falsely imprisoned for far too long. Thank you."
You have people, go quickly and give their testimony one right after another. And when you bring a daughter or a wife and she sits down and starts testifying, you couldn't see it in that video, but literally the whole room turns around and looks who's speaking.
Yeah.
And they never do that. They don't turn around. They just listen, to the interpretation. But as soon as she sat down and said who she was and she was there on behalf of her father, the whole room turned around. So it makes a huge difference to have family members.
And look, when we sought that UN NGO status all those years ago, so we had a fight to get that. I mean, I had a fight. We led a team. It was a fight
Even
to
our
get that
supporters
status.
thought, why do you want to deal with the UN?
And that's exactly why you want to deal with the UN. You saw
That's
it
in Switzerland. I just want to remind people that in Switzerland, the UN Human Rights Council, which is not always a friendly place to the U.S. or our issues, but on these issues of persecution is. And their daughter was
you
there.
have to be there. You have to be there.
But she was able to speak because of our status.
Yes, absolutely.
And we got a win with the working group on arbitrary detention from the UN, and that was huge.
Yeah, so all those factors make a big difference. We only got a minute left here, so I'll go first to Noreen, then to Andrew. So you're out. What was your first reaction when you got the word that when you were on that airplane on the way back? How do you feel?
I was waiting. I was watching the map and waiting till we actually left airspace, Turkish airspace, because that's when I would truly relax.
Did you relax?
Oh, once that happened, yes. But I watched us climb instead of leaving straight away, so it was a long ways.
Yeah. What about you, Andrew?
It was unbelievable to me.
Yeah.
Surreal.
Well, I want you to know this, and I know you spoke to our team here at our media center, and I really appreciate you taking time to do that because they worked. Most of the folks are still here. Some have gone on other things, but all of them that worked on this really did a fantastic job of being creative to keep you in the news, to keep this front and center. And we're grateful to God, obviously, for the grace that he gave us and the wisdom that he gave us and the endurance that he gave you, Andrew, because I know that was
We are so thankful for ACLJ.
Well, I appreciate that. I know all of our members do too. That's going to do it for the broadcast today. Let me encourage you to do something, and that is, as we've been talking to Andrew Brunson, his wife Noreen, and their great victory that we saw in that case, let's not forget that we've got other cases we're handling right now, and your prayers and support make a huge difference. Let me encourage you to go to ACLJ.org, sign that petition for Pastor Saul, but also support the work of the ACLJ. You can do that at ACLJ.org. See you next week.
Christian pastor John Saw, a U.S. permanent resident, has been wrongfully convicted and sentenced in China. After decades working in China and Burma, providing for the poor, sharing the love of Christ, and establishing schools for impoverished children, Pastor John was arrested and imprisoned by Chinese authorities. Pastor John's wife and two sons, all U.S. citizens from North Carolina, desperately want their father released and returned home to America. Pastor John has been unjustly targeted for his Christian faith and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He's now been imprisoned 2 years. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're representing Pastor John's family, aggressively working internationally and in this country for his ultimate freedom. Stand with us. Sign on to our petition to free Pastor John Saw. You can add your name right now online at aclj.org.